Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started, Ify, if you're ready.
Yes,
Perfect.
sounds good.
Okay. So first of all, thank you to everyone who is joining us today. To start off, I want to go ahead and mention that we do have a 15% off discount code that's going to be valid for 48 hours following this webinar to register for our 6th Chief Patient Officer Summit on July 23rd and 24th in Boston, Massachusetts. The code is going to be webinar 345. We're very excited to welcome Dr. Ify Osunkwo, a global advocate with more than 20 years of experience across the healthcare industry, with roots in academic medicine and clinical research. Ify is currently the Global Hemoglobinopathies Advocacy Lead at Novo Nordisk. Our topic today is going to be patient advocacy beyond titles. We'll go over 3 different dimensions of patient advocacy. These are going to include what does patient advocacy truly mean, how to look at your role as an ambassador of wins for all stakeholders, and finally, highlighting patient advocacy as a strategic lever that de-risks drug development through its efforts of aligning patient needs to company work and growing allyship that embraces innovation. Before we jump in, though, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Ify for a second to introduce herself.
Thank you so much, Madison, and hello, everybody. I am Ify Osunkwo. I am the Advocacy Lead for Hemoglobinopathies for Novo Nordisk Rare Disease, and the topic today is advocacy beyond titles. Exactly 3 months ago, I was a Chief Patient Officer for Rare Disease at Novo Nordisk. My job title changed, but the work I do essentially did not change. And of course, those of you who work in industry understand company restructuring and reorganization, hence the title change. My background is in pediatric hematology oncology that moved into lifespan hematology and public health, advocacy, patient engagement, and then now drug development. And so I'm really excited to be here today. This will be my 4th CPO conference in attendance, and I'm really excited. Madison?
Yeah, awesome. So, starting out, we're going to cover what the true definition of patient advocacy means. Ify, for our first question, when you use the term patient advocacy, what does it truly mean in practice and not just in theory?
That's a great question. And you've heard terms like patient engagement, patient advocacy, corporate affairs, government affairs, public affairs. Every company has a different name, patient partnerships, patient and provider partnerships. So every company calls it something different. But being an advocate is basically someone who works with individuals or groups to go from point A to point B, where point B is better in terms of value, access, and opportunity compared to point A. So that's the very simplistic way we define patient advocacy. You are working with the patient community to get them from where they were to where they want to be, whatever that destination of choice is. But you cannot do advocacy without engagement. And so my team was originally called the patient engagement team, and we then evolved into the patient advocacy team. And really, engagement supplies the evidence and authenticity of the patient voice in drug development. But advocacy will organize all of these inputs and use it to elevate the patient's voice to achieve change, whether it's increased innovation, access, increase amplifying of their voice, or getting to some sort of state where they have a better outcome than they had before.
I love that. Are there certain ways that sometimes organizations misunderstand or even misuse the term patient advocacy?
I think the biggest thing I see is where we look at advocacy as separate from engagement. You can't advocate for someone until you engage that person. It's like kind of, I want to get to Texas from New Jersey,
Mm.
but I don't want to buy a train ticket or a plane ticket. You're not going to walk to Texas, right? And so engagement is the path that builds a relationship and builds a trust to allow that transparent communication of this is what I need, this is what you need, this is what we need together, and how we can work together that kind of walks the walk of getting to that advocacy output, which is where patient advocacy really demonstrates its strength.
Absolutely. And then how can organizations ensure that patient advocacy remains patient-led rather than company-led?
Now, that's the $1 million question. And when we answer that and solve it for everybody, then we'll all have no jobs and we'll be able to find different careers. I think the regulatory landscape right now requires that we gather patient input into our drug development programs. And many companies are well intentioned in trying to find ways of engaging patients to gather their input. And that's wonderful and that's great. The how you do it is really important. Are you doing it as a checkbox, or are you truly going in there because there's a win-win for both parties, right? You're not just, meeting the letter of the law for EMA and FDA, but you are going into this because you're developing drugs for a community that has a need, and you want to make sure that whatever you develop is something that meets the needs of the patients, but of course also meets the needs of the company. And when I call this, being an ambassador of wins, that's really what I'm talking about. As a patient advocate in a company, my job is to be the ambassador of the company to the community of the patients, and then be the ambassador for the patients inside the company. So an ambassador has to have certain character traits. You have to be a master translator. You have to be able to speak patient speak and also company speak to the opposite party. You have to be able to be a strategist. How do you take the company vision and mission, which truly ends up being to make a profit, and translate that into a value that is of importance to the community? And then how do you take the patient's values and make sure that your company understands that, yes, you're going to make a profit, but the way you do it matters more than where you get in terms of your P&L. The other part of being a patient advocate is being an excellent communicator. You have to be able to translate everything to every function, to every stakeholder. It's like selling a cruise. Some people go on a cruise to drink or to have parties or to go on the bungee jumping or to be in a quiet, retreat. Everybody has something that they take to go on. They want to get out of a cruise. So my job is to make sure that I sell to medical what they need, I sell to commercial what they need, but I also sell to the patients what they need and do it in a way that is truthful, transparent, and honest. The other part is resiliency, because we get a lot of knocks in this game. Pilots start, pilots end. You convince somebody and then they switch jobs and somebody else comes, you have to start all over again. And then the other part is you have to be bold and courageous and sometimes be the one who tells the patients what they don't want to hear or tells the company what they don't want to hear. And then last but not least, you have to love people because you're dealing with people every day. You have to be somebody who's not afraid of talking to people, of engaging people, of hearing the good, the bad, and the ugly from both parties, not taking it personal, but really driving a conversation that doesn't just stop once a goal is achieved, but an ongoing bi-directional communication.
I love that. Every part of what you just said. That's absolutely amazing. I think, like, what's just one question that teams should ask themselves to validate whether an initiative truly centers around the patient's needs?
Did I ask them?
Mhm.
Before you start anything, before you do anything in your company, whether it's a campaign, whether it's picking an asset to move forward into G1, did you ask the people who will be impacted by this asset, by this decision? Because at the end of the day, nobody wants you to come into their house and rearrange their furniture and tell them, oh, your house is now beautiful because I showed up, right?
Yeah.
They want you to work with them to design the layout, pick the furniture pieces, and then redesign the room. So you have to ask the people who are going to benefit, what do you want? What's important to you? How do you want it? What way would I serve it up to you that will make it more palatable, more engaging, or more beneficial to you? Because at the end of the day, if you don't ask them early in the beginning, you run the risk of running into trouble in terms of uptake and persistence at the end. And sometimes the time between is 7 or 8 years, but the lack of investment early leads to downstream launch failures 7, 8 years down the line. And I think that's something that when we look at our functions and the way we manage our budgets, everybody looks at it in a 1 year sprint. But patient advocacy and engagement is not a 1 year sprint, it's an ongoing longitudinal process from the beginning of the drug being chosen to go into development to the end when it gets sunset or it fails the development process. Bringing them along the journey is probably the most important thing you can do in terms of patient advocacy.
100%. I agree with you on that. And then before we move on, I wanted to go ahead and ask the audience if there were any questions over that section. And if so, please put them in the chat, and I would love to answer. And if you, if you would love to answer,
We will answer together.
I was like, and then we'll go ahead and move on to our next section, and we're going to be looking at how this role as an ambassador of wins for all stakeholders. And then to get started, Ify, what does success look like when patient, company, and internal team priorities are all aligned?
It's maybe intuitive, maybe not. Success means we were all heard. It doesn't mean the pilot worked or didn't work. It doesn't mean that I got what I wanted or I didn't get what I want. It means that we all listened to each other and we all heard each other. And I think that's the foundation of any trust-based relationship. That's the foundation of engaging with dignity with people. The company wants to be heard. It takes a lot of money to develop a drug. And a lot of times the community doesn't understand that. The patients want to be heard. Your drug may be what I need, but the way you deliver it may not be how I want it, right? And so I may not engage in the treatment because I don't trust you. So they also want to be heard. And I think when you think about the way the relationship needs to evolve, it needs to be something where we're having ongoing bidirectional communication all the time. And when you do that, it makes it easier for quote unquote failures to be received by the patient community. Sometimes we're so scared of admitting failure to somebody else because we think it'll make us more vulnerable that we break trust really early in the relationship. Patients don't care if the drug fails or doesn't fail. I mean, I'm being a little bit facetious here. They just want to know the truth, and we tell them every drug has a chance of failure that may be higher for some assets and lower for some assets, but there's a chance of failure. But if they know that up front and you keep them up to date all along the way, they will walk with you through the failed asset development program. They won't abandon you when the drug doesn't make it to G4 or G3, right? It's being vulnerable on both sides. They are inherently vulnerable because they're patients. We need to be vulnerable as companies by being transparent and open. And I have to remember, people, transparency doesn't mean give them all your trade secrets. It means tell them the truth about what is important to them that is part of the development journey, right? It doesn't mean you have to give them all your trade secrets, but tell them yes or no right away. Don't wait for 6 months before you tell them the no you could have told them 6 months ago, because then they lose trust in you.
Yeah. Do you have an example when prioritizing patients' needs like ultimately led to an accelerated company objective or de-risked a company
So
objective?
I joined my company right around the time when we were putting a drug into phase 2. And the study was dealing with a delayed recruitment, like 2 years delayed recruitment. And part of the challenge was we were new into this therapy area. We didn't have a robust relationship with the community, and we are a very shy company, very, very introverted. And there was a lot of questions that were out there but not being answered. And what we did right off the bat was open up the door to begin to answer those questions. Most of the time, the answer was, we don't know. But just hearing from the company that they didn't know reduced the anxiety that the community felt about this new asset that's being developed. And it was so interesting because it took 6 months and we ended up getting to where our recruitment was on target. And then we ended up finishing early. Because at the end of the day, patients want new options and they know that not every bet's going to win. But if you open up the journey for them to join you on the journey, they are more than willing to join you and embark on that risking with you. Now, when we talk about patient advocacy helps to de-risk drug development, that's what I'm talking about. It de-risks your timelines for clinical trial recruitment. It de-risks your messaging when it comes to commercialization. How does the impact of this treatment resonate with me? If you ask me as a patient, I will give you the terms and the verbiage for your campaign. But if you go off and you talk to the vendors and you come up with some fancy campaign, but it's tone deaf to the community, you have spent all this money on a campaign that nobody really cares about. And you've wasted a lot of time and effort, and you may not succeed in your launch. So there's many different examples where just opening up to the community, they would advocate for treatment that benefits them if they are brought along the journey of developing that treatment for them. Remember this saying that says, nothing for me without me? It's so true in drug development. I mean, it's true in every aspect of life. I don't want my husband to pick a place to go to dinner that I don't agree with. He has to ask me, do I want to go to, is it Chinese today? Or is it going to be American? Is it going to be Italian? If I'm not in the mood for Chinese, don't take me to a Chinese restaurant.
Exactly. Perfect. Thank you. And then For the next question, how does patient advocacy function translate patient insights into wins for teams like R&D, medical affairs, access, and commercial without losing that aspect of the patient voice?
And I think the fundamental piece is if we understand what is the purpose of patient advocacy,
Hmm.
right? I have a condition X. You have a treatment that you believe will solve my condition X or make it better. But you do not have my condition X. So the best thing you can do is to learn from me with condition X. What are my pain points? What problems do I wish to solve? And I'll give you an example. Way before I joined industry, I have asthma and I sometimes get acute exacerbations and I go to the emergency room. And the science says when you're getting a breathing treatment, there's a little device you put in your mouth and you hold it between your two lips and you breathe in through your mouth. Well, if you've ever had trouble breathing and they give you that device to breathe through your mouth when you're having an asthma attack, you would understand that that is the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard because it's so uncomfortable. You can't breathe. And now you have to hold the device with your lips and take deep breaths. Well, the alternative is a mask that is passive and you can still breathe in. It may not be scientifically perfect, but it's humanistically the better option for
Yeah,
an actual patient.
yeah.
And so listening to what the patient wants is so simple. It helps you design and innovate better. In
Mhm.
no other environment would you develop a pair of shoes, um, um, Spanx, leggings, without testing with the customer if they like the feel of the material or they like the fit of the fabric or if they like the texture of the device. We go and we do consumer testing on everything. And why not ask the consumer of the drug if this development plan resonates with what their pain points are? It makes no sense to develop a treatment that is not solving a real problem for somebody.
Yeah,
Nobody would do that in business, and so why would you do that in drug development?
exactly. It's even more important in drug development than
Absolutely.
it is in business anyway.
Yeah.
Perfect. Is there a certain mindset shift that should be required for organizations to truly view patient advocacy as a strategic connector rather than a support function?
Yeah, so there's two things. One, the fear of compliance. I think what drives a lot of anxiety around keeping the patients very far away from the development pathway is this fear that we're going to somehow or the other get ourselves in a compliance breach, right? And so making the company members aware that these are the compliance guardrails that govern patient advocacy and engagement. And once people understand it, then it makes it a lot easier. The other piece is really socializing to every single function, whether it's medical, whether it's commercial, whether it's marketing, whether it's medical and science, the value of what we just talked about, hearing the patient's perspective before you make a decision on which path to take. Because if you don't, then I like to make it more personal. We had this initiative we launched last year in a company called Walk in My Shoes. But we actually had people in the company, there was a lottery, and you got to pick to walk in the shoes of a patient for a day. You spent the day with them and you kind of saw, their day-to-day life.
Mhm.
Because a lot of times, if you've never been a patient, if you've never had a pain point, if you've never been a caregiver of a patient, it's really hard to translate that into your day-to-day work. But
Yeah.
when you, I mean, our finance lady was with a patient and it completely transformed her way of looking at things. She was like, oh my God, I had no idea. So it's really, you want to put yourself in the shoes of the recipient of your innovation and let that influence every single aspect of the cogwheel that churns out treatment options for our patients. We cannot operate in silos. We have to operate in a continuum. What happens in early phase development impacts what happens in phase three, phase four. It impacts what medical does. It impacts what commercial does in terms of launch preparation. It impacts in terms of what the ecosystem is willing to accept and receive. And one part of patient advocacy that we don't talk about is the part that drives regulatory approval and access to the treatment once it's actually approved by the regulators. You know, you can
Mhm.
have a drug that is passes a phase three, excellent results, and nobody wants to pay for it. Well, who is going to push the demand for it to be paid for? It's the patient who is going to use the treatment, who sees the value in that treatment, and who advocates for that treatment to be approved by being educated by what the treatment offers or doesn't offer, understanding the landscape of regulatory process and approval and a financing process in their country, and then going out there to push for, say, look, my patient community has this need. We believe that this treatment is going to help, and we are asking that you find a way to support us to get access to these treatments. And that partnership is critical. No one person can do it by themselves. Industry has to partner with community, has to partner with governments, has to partner with other stakeholders to make sure that the 360 is covered.
Absolutely. Amazing. Okay. We're going to be moving on to our next section. Go ahead and feel free to put questions into the chat whenever you would like to. But moving on, how do we operationalize patient insights so they meaningfully shape protocol design, endpoints, and trial experience?
I love that question because it takes me back to what I said. You need to be a master strategist, an excellent communicator, and you got to be bold and courageous. You
Yeah.
first have to know in your company who are the stakeholders that are important in these different functions, who make the decisions of what has to happen, what can happen, and who want to make a change, but they can't because they're afraid of XYZ. So, understanding your internal landscape and how things operate in your company is the first thing you have to do. And then making sure that you bring them along the journey of patient insight gathering.
Yeah.
Most companies have systems where they gather insights from patients. Where we fail, for the most part, is making that system of translating the insight into action, systematic and almost like, I don't want to say idiot proof, but almost like a standard operating procedure.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you know that when you're cooking, you first chop up the vegetables, then you cook the meat, and then you put the seasoning. You have steps you take, right? We need to make sure that we embed, you gather the insights, you summarize the insights, you make sure you touch base with clinical development, medical and science and medical about what those insights suggest, and you discuss with them what can we operationally change or not change and why,
Yeah.
right? And then you feed that back to the patient community so that they can understand what the barriers are when they give you a recommendation and you cannot take it. Or when you do take the recommendation, go back and let them know. What that does is that it builds more trust and they're willing to share with you more and more of what you would need to know to be able to help your drug development go much smoother, much faster, and without a lot with a lot less barriers. And so making that process of getting the insights, summarizing the insights, identifying action steps, and then translating it to actual actions by the different functions, that has to become much more streamlined. And in these days of AI, it shouldn't be so hard to do, unlike before, where everything sits in a SharePoint site in a big PDF, and nobody can really tell what happened last year because somebody left the company and then it was in her inbox and she's no longer here. We need to figure out a way to make this almost so normal that it's like, a routine that doesn't depend on an individual. It's just the way
Yeah.
things operate in the company.
Yeah. And that kind of goes hand in hand about building allyship around internal teams and external. Like, how does building that allyship across those teams and communities enable more innovative development approaches?
I love allyship because an ally is somebody who is you when you're not there, right? So I have an ally in medical affairs who is focused on doctor insights, but also understands that, sometimes doctors think doctors speak and they don't understand patients speak. And so he's like, oh, Ify, what are the patients saying about this? I'm talking to the doctors about. And then we compare notes. He takes that back to the physicians and say, hey, by the way, your patients are saying this. What do you think about that? And then he brings back to me, Ify, the doctors are saying X, Y, Z. See what the patients think about that. So that's what allyship is. And what it is, it smoothens the pathway of getting insights into action.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you don't have allies in the different functions, you end up with almost like a roadblock or a gate between where the insight gets into the function, but it doesn't kind of translate into any kind of meaningful activity or meaningful change in their decision making process. That's what allyship is about. Now, the problem with allyship is it requires influence. It requires you in patient advocacy to be able to influence other people. And I worry that if there is no formal patient advocacy function, how do you build those allies? And typically, what happens, somebody in a function takes it upon themselves to be the advocate for the company on behalf of the patients. But we need to make this a little bit more structured and a little bit more mandatory, where someone in the company has that task as their I guess, their KPI, and making sure that they are the translators of patient insights to the different functions so that the actions can be carried out. Now, when it comes to externals, again, it's all about influence and connectivity and sharing. I tell people, sometimes patient advocacy groups don't just want your money, they just want to talk to you,
Mm-hmm.
to understand your world so that they can know how best to interact with your world. I've had multiple discussions with patient groups, and we don't talk anything about a project or about their sponsorship. It's all about what is life like in industry and what is life like as a patient advocacy lead, right? In a patient organization. How do you bridge the two? How do you manage your volunteers? What suggestions do you have about making sure that people show up for events that I host? We have expertise and skills that are not necessarily dollar signs, but it's the network, it's encouragement, it's we call it sparring in my company, where it's a Danish company. Pressure testing your idea, talking about what would you do in this kind of scenario, what would you do in that kind of scenario, or just sharing experiences, right? And so we need to look at this as more of relational and not only transactional.
Yeah, I love that. And then, what role does advocacy play in helping organizations responsibly adopt new technologies and trial models? I know that's kind of a vibe switch, but
Yep, yep, yep. Sometimes it's the other way around.
yeah.
What can communities teach us in industry about vibe switching so that we can pick up what is really happening in real life? And again, when you meet with your patient groups monthly, quarterly, whatever the cadence is, and you're sharing experiences and you're updating, this is where you guys learn about the other person's day to day. This is where they tell you, oh, so tell me about this new program you guys are launching. I saw something on LinkedIn. Can you share compliantly any information? And you begin to share with them just facts, about what you guys are doing and where do you think the field is going. This is part of, we call it, regular touch points or updates with our patient organizations. They tell us what the vibe is in the community, and we let them know what the vibe is in the company. When we were going through our restructuring recently, I was meeting with my patient groups. It would have been facetious not to say, oh, by the way, my company is going through a major transformation. Because guess what? They were seeing it on LinkedIn and they were seeing it on the news. And if I didn't bring it up, they would look at me like, okay, Ify is not being transparent, right? So sometimes you just have to be a normal, relational human being and
Yeah.
tell the truth, and again, it's all about relational understanding and relating with people and providing value. I look at every interaction I have, whether it's internal or external,
Mhm.
within the lens of what can I do in this next meeting to provide value to the person who's attending this meeting and who's going to interact with me. And it could just be, I hope you're having a great day. Or it could be, oh my God, I'm so sorry that that happened to you. Or it could be more tactical stuff that we're dealing with. But I want to leave every encounter, the person needs to be better off after I meet with them, right? And
Yeah.
sometimes it's such intangible things. It may be listening to them vent about how horrible they think industry is, and that's totally okay. And don't go on the defensive, it's not personal, but they had an experience. And then you validate that experience and you help them process it and eventually give them the facts around why sometimes things seem to not work the way they want it to work because we have constraints. You would be surprised at how many community members and even physicians have no idea the compliance guardrails we have to operate under. I had a group say to me, oh, I want a sponsorship. I want to be able to go on a cruise across the river of the Vienne. I was like, that's not going to happen. They're like, what do you mean? I said, we can't do that. We're going to get arrested and put in jail. But they didn't understand it because guess what? Back in the day, they could,
Yeah.
but 2025, not so much. And I have
Yeah.
why. We can't sponsor a safari. We can't sponsor a social event, right? We have to only sponsor things that are allowed in the compliance bucket. But they don't understand it. And so we need to make sure that we explain to them the why behind the decisions that we make so that they can kind of, again, stay with us along that journey.
Yeah. I love that. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our questions, but I just wanted to thank you so much, Ify, for joining us. And I want to give a little bit of time for people to put questions in the chat if they have them at all. And then as we're waiting for that, I wanted to go ahead and remind everybody about the discount code that's going to be available for 48 hours for our 6th Chief Patient Officer Summit in Boston on July 23rd and 24th. Ify will be speaking there, as well as several other amazing presenters and speakers, and our brochure is going live soon, so please keep that on your calendars. And I really, really hope to
Yes.
see everyone there. And I'm so excited to see Ify again as well.
Yes.
But
All roads lead to Boston.
yes, yeah, exactly. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, everyone. And remember, you need to be a psychologist, you need to be a communicator, a master strategist, a translator. But at the end of the day, it's about connecting with people. They're human, we're human. I know we work for industry, but at the end of the day, industry is made up of human beings. And so I love my job, and I'm sure anybody who's in this field loves what they do as well. It's nice to meet you. And great. Thank you so much, Madison.
Thank you, guys.